In the winter of 1897, when investigative journalist Thomas Mitchell arrived at Willowbrook Hospital in Illinois, he carried with him a simple question that would uncover one of America's most disturbing medical secrets. Why were dozens of patients being admitted to the hospital's registry, only to vanish without a trace from all official records? What he discovered in the basement of that respectable institution would shake the very foundations of medical ethics in the Midwest. Before we dive into this chilling investigation that exposed the darkest corners of 19th century medicine, I need your help to keep bringing you these untold stories. If you're ready to uncover the truth about Willowbrook Hospital, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden past. Also, I'm curious about our community. Drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're listening from. Your support helps us continue exploring these forgotten mysteries. Now let's discover what really happened to the lost patients of Willowbrook. The story we're about to tell comes from fragments of testimony, hidden documents, and whispered accounts that survived the systematic destruction of evidence in 1897. According to the testimonies that surfaced years later, Willowbrook was a small industrial town in central Illinois, built around the expanding railroad network that connected Chicago to the farming communities of the heartland. In 1896, the town boasted nearly 3,000 residents, most of them working in the grain elevators, railroad yards, or the growing number of factories that processed agricultural products for shipment east. Willowbrook General Hospital stood on Elm Street, a three-story brick building that had been constructed in 1889 with funds donated by the town's most prominent families. The hospital's red brick facade and white-painted windows gave it an air of respectability that matched its reputation throughout central Illinois. Local newspapers frequently praised the institution for its modern facilities and progressive medical practices, noting that it served not only the residents of Willowbrook, but also patients from neighboring communities who traveled there seeking quality medical care. Dr. William Brooke, the hospital's chief physician and one of its founding board members, was a respected figure in the community. A graduate of Rush Medical College in Chicago, Dr. Brooke had arrived in Willowbrook in 1888, drawn by the opportunity to establish a modern medical practice in a growing town. He was known for his meticulous record-keeping, his innovative surgical techniques, and his willingness to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay. The local Methodist church, where Dr. Brooke served as a deacon, regularly held fundraising drives to help cover the cost of treating indigent patients at the hospital. The hospital employed 12 staff members, including 3 nurses, 2 orderlies, a cook, and several cleaning staff. The head nurse, Margaret Sullivan, had worked alongside Dr. Brooke since the hospital's opening. A devout Catholic from County Cork, Ireland, Margaret had immigrated to America in 1885 and trained as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago before accepting the position in Willowbrook. Her colleagues described her as compassionate but extremely professional, with an almost obsessive attention to detail in patient care and record-keeping. In the autumn of 1896, Willowbrook began experiencing an influx of transient workers and immigrant families, drawn by the promise of seasonal work in the grain elevators and the construction of a new railroad junction. Many of these newcomers arrived with little money and no permanent address, making them dependent on charity for medical care when illness or injury struck. The hospital's charity ward, located on the second floor, regularly accommodated these vulnerable patients, and Dr. Brooke's reputation for treating the poor without payment made Willowbrook General a beacon of hope for those who had nowhere else to turn. The chain of events that would eventually expose the hospital's darkest secrets began on the cold morning of October 15th, 1896, when Margaret Sullivan noticed something troubling in the patient admission records. As part of her weekly routine, she was reconciling the ward patient counts with the official registry when she discovered that 3 patients who had been admitted to the charity ward in the previous month were no longer listed in any hospital records. The first was Henrik Larsson, a Swedish immigrant who had been brought to the hospital after suffering severe burns in a factory accident. Margaret clearly remembered admitting him to bed number 7 in the charity ward, recording his injuries in her nursing log, and noting that Dr. Brooke had ordered special treatment for his wounds. Yet when she searched for Larsson's file in the records office, it was nowhere to be found. Even more disturbing, her own nursing notes for that week had been replaced with new pages that made no mention of the Swedish patient. The second missing patient was Maria Gonzalez, a young Mexican woman who had arrived at the hospital in severe labor complications. Margaret had assisted Dr. Brooke during an emergency procedure that saved both mother and child, and she distinctly remembered the woman's recovery over the following week. But like Larsson, all traces of Maria Gonzalez had vanished from the hospital records, as if she had never existed. The third case was perhaps the most unsettling. Thomas O'Malley, an Irish labourer who had been admitted with symptoms of pneumonia, had been in the charity ward for nearly 2 weeks. Margaret had grown fond of the elderly man, who reminded her of her own father back in Ireland. She had personally overseen his medication schedule and had been pleased with his steady improvement. Then one morning in early October, O'Malley's bed was empty, his belongings were gone, and when Margaret inquired about his discharge, she was told by Dr. Brooke that no such patient had ever been admitted to the hospital. Margaret's initial confusion quickly turned to alarm when she realized that her detailed nursing logs for all 3 patients had been systematically removed and replaced. The handwriting in the replacement logs was undoubtedly hers, but she had no memory of writing these particular entries. Even more disturbing, the financial records showed no billing for any of these patients, despite the fact that the hospital typically maintained detailed accounts of charity care for reporting to the State Medical Board. When Margaret approached Dr. Brooke about the discrepancies, his response was uncharacteristically dismissive. He suggested that the stress of managing the busy charity ward might be affecting her memory, and he recommended that she take a few days of rest. This response troubled Margaret deeply, as Dr. Brooke had always valued her meticulous attention to detail and had never questioned her competence in the 8 years they had worked together. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home to her boarding house as usual, she remained in the hospital after dark, determined to investigate what was happening to the missing patients. Armed with a kerosene lamp and her master key to the hospital's various departments, she began a systematic search of the building, looking for any trace of the 3 patients who had seemingly vanished into thin air. The impact of Margaret's discovery rippled through the following weeks like stones thrown into still water. Unable to shake her suspicions about the missing patients, she began keeping her own secret records, documenting every patient admission and discharge in a private journal that she kept hidden in her room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Pine Street. By November of 1896, Margaret's clandestine record-keeping had revealed a disturbing pattern. At least 12 patients had been admitted to the charity ward over the past 6 months, only to disappear completely from all official hospital documentation. The missing patients shared several characteristics. They were all poor, most were recent immigrants or transient workers, and none had family members in Willowbrook who might inquire about their whereabouts. The hospital staff seemed genuinely unaware of the discrepancies. When Margaret carefully questioned the orderlies and cleaning staff about specific patients, their responses suggested that their memories had been somehow adjusted. They would recall helping with certain cases, but when pressed for details, they became confused and eventually insisted that they must have been thinking of different patients. Even more unsettling, Margaret discovered that she herself sometimes struggled to remember exact details about the missing patients, as if her own memories were becoming unreliable. Dr. Brooks' behavior during this period became increasingly erratic. The man who had once insisted on personally reviewing every patient file now seemed to discourage detailed record-keeping. He instituted new policies that limited access to patient files and assigned himself exclusive responsibility for documenting charity cases. When Margaret suggested that the hospital's accounting practices might benefit from a more systematic approach, Dr. Brooks' response was sharp and final. The hospital's financial records were his responsibility alone, and she should focus on patient care rather than administrative matters. The first breakthrough in understanding what was happening came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Anna Kowalski, an elderly Polish woman who cleaned the hospital's lower floors, approached Margaret one evening in late November with a troubling observation. In her broken English, she explained that she had been finding strange stains in the basement that required increasingly harsh chemicals to remove. More disturbing, she had noticed that certain areas of the basement, particularly near the coal furnace, were now off-limits to cleaning staff. Dr. Brooke had personally instructed her to avoid those areas, claiming they contained dangerous medical equipment that could be damaged by improper cleaning. Margaret's investigation took on new urgency when she learned that Thomas Mitchell, a journalist from the Chicago Tribune, had been asking questions around town about Willowbrook Hospital. Mitchell had arrived in town following up on a tip from a source in Chicago who claimed that several Polish immigrants had traveled to Willowbrook for medical treatment and had never returned home. Their families had received no word from them, and inquiries to the hospital had yielded only confusion and contradictory information. Mitchell's investigation method was methodical and thorough, shaped by his years of exposing corruption in Chicago's political machine. He began by interviewing families in Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods, documenting cases of relatives who had traveled to Willowbrook for medical care and had never been heard from again. His notes, which would later be preserved in the Tribune's archives, reveal a pattern of disappearances that stretched back to the hospital's opening in 1889. The journalist's arrival in Willowbrook in December 1896 coincided with Margaret's growing determination to uncover the truth. Through careful inquiry, Mitchell learned about the discrepancies in patient records, and he arranged a clandestine meeting with Margaret at the Lutheran church on the outskirts of town. During this meeting, Margaret shared her private journal and her suspicions about the basement areas that had been declared off-limits to cleaning staff. Mitchell's newspaper experience had taught him to look for financial motives behind institutional corruption. His investigation into Willowbrook Hospital's finances revealed several troubling patterns. The hospital's published annual reports showed a remarkably high success rate in treating charity patients, with mortality rates significantly lower than other institutions of similar size. However, these statistics seemed inconsistent with the high number of indigent patients the hospital claimed to serve. More suspicious was the hospital's relationship with several prestigious medical institutions in Chicago and Boston. Mitchell discovered that Dr. Brooke regularly corresponded with physicians at these institutions, apparently sharing information about innovative treatment methods and surgical techniques. Several medical journals had published papers crediting Willowbrook Hospital with pioneering approaches to treating industrial injuries, infectious diseases, and surgical complications. For a small-town hospital, this level of medical innovation and research seemed remarkably advanced. The breakthrough came when Mitchell gained access to the hospital's purchasing records through a sympathetic clerk at the medical supply company in Springfield. The records revealed that Willowbrook Hospital was ordering medical supplies and equipment far in excess of what would be needed for its officially documented patient load. More intriguingly, the hospital was purchasing experimental medications and surgical instruments that were typically used only in research settings, not for routine patient care. Mitchell's investigation also uncovered evidence of two separate accounting systems. The official books, which were provided to state inspectors and used for public reporting, showed modest revenues and expenses, consistent with a small community hospital. However, bank records suggested that the hospital was receiving substantial payments from medical institutions in major cities, payments that did not appear in the official accounting ledgers. The evidence Mitchell was uncovering painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple record-keeping errors. If you're finding this investigation as disturbing as I am, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was really happening in that basement? Let's continue unraveling this medical mystery together. The winter of 1896-1897 brought the investigation to a critical point when Margaret Sullivan made a discovery that would prove both crucial and dangerous. On the night of January 12, 1897, she used her master key to access the hospital's basement areas that had been declared off-limits to staff. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. The basement of Willowbrook Hospital had been divided into two distinct sections. The public area, which housed the hospital's boiler, coal storage, and legitimate medical supplies, was familiar to all staff members. However, behind a locked door that Margaret had never noticed before, she discovered a fully equipped medical facility that rivaled the surgical suite on the hospital's main floor. This hidden section contained 6 hospital beds, complete with restraints and monitoring equipment. The walls were lined with cabinets filled with experimental medications, many bearing labels from pharmaceutical companies in Germany and France. A large table in the center of the room was equipped with surgical instruments that Margaret didn't recognize, along with detailed charts showing human anatomy and what appeared to be systematic documentation of medical procedures. Most disturbing of all was a filing cabinet containing detailed records of patients who matched the descriptions of those who had disappeared from the official hospital records. The files documented experimental procedures, medication trials, and surgical techniques that went far beyond standard medical practice. Each file contained photographs, detailed notes about patient responses to various treatments, and outcomes that were coded in a system Margaret didn't understand. Margaret's hands shook as she examined file after file, recognizing the names and faces of patients she remembered treating in the charity ward. Henrik Larsson's file documented a series of experimental skin grafts using techniques that were apparently being developed for treating factory burn victims. Maria Gonzalez's record showed that she had been subjected to experimental obstetric procedures designed to test new methods of surgical delivery. Thomas O'Malley, the elderly Irishman Margaret had grown fond of, had been used to test new medications for treating respiratory ailments. The most chilling discovery was a second set of records that documented the disposal of patients who did not survive the experimental procedures. These files were marked with red ink and contained detailed notes about cremation procedures, the destruction of personal belongings, and the systematic removal of all traces of the patient's existence from official hospital records. As Margaret photographed the files with a camera she had borrowed from Mitchell, she heard footsteps in the corridor above. Quickly extinguishing her lamp, she hid behind a cabinet as the basement door opened, and Dr. Brooke descended the stairs, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize. From her hiding place, she could hear them discussing the arrival of a new group of patients from Chicago, patients who would be ideal subjects for testing a new surgical procedure that had been requested by physicians at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Brooks' conversation with his companions revealed the full scope of the operation. Willowbrook Hospital was serving as a testing facility for experimental medical procedures that were too dangerous or controversial to be conducted at prestigious institutions. The hospital's isolation and its steady supply of indigent patients with no family connections made it an ideal location for this type of research. The patients were not told about the experimental nature of their treatment, and those who survived were often released with no memory of what had been done to them, their records altered to show routine medical care. The confrontation that would expose the entire operation came on the night of February 3rd, 1897, when Margaret Sullivan and Thomas Mitchell executed a plan to document the hospital's illegal activities and alert authorities in Springfield. Margaret had arranged to admit Mitchell to the hospital as a patient, claiming he had suffered injuries in a railroad accident. This would give him access to the hospital's interior, while Margaret created a distraction that would allow them to access the hidden basement facility together. The plan began to unravel when Dr. Brooke became suspicious of the new patient's unusually detailed questions about hospital procedures. Instead of being taken to a regular ward, Mitchell found himself being escorted to the basement facility, where Dr. Brooke revealed that he had discovered Margaret's investigation weeks earlier and had been monitoring both her activities and Mitchell's inquiries around town. "You see, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Brooke explained as they descended into the hidden facility, progress in medical science requires sacrifices that comfortable people in comfortable places are unwilling to make. The procedures we develop here save hundreds of lives in hospitals across the country. The patients we treat would die anyway from their injuries and illnesses. At least this way, their suffering contributes to something greater than their individual misery." Dr. Brooke's justification for the experimental procedures revealed a worldview shaped by the social Darwinism popular among educated Americans in the 1890s. He genuinely believed that indigent patients, particularly immigrants and transient workers, were less valuable than the wealthy patients who would eventually benefit from the medical advances developed through the secret research. In his mind, the systematic violation of medical ethics was justified by the greater good that would result from the knowledge gained. The basement facility, Mitchell discovered, was connected to a network of similar operations in small hospitals across the Midwest. Dr. Brooke was part of an informal consortium of physicians who shared experimental data and coordinated their research to avoid duplication. The system was funded by wealthy philanthropists and medical institutions who wanted access to cutting-edge treatments but were unwilling to risk their reputations by conducting controversial research under their own names. Margaret's attempt to rescue Mitchell led to a confrontation in the basement facility that exposed the full horror of the operation. As Dr. Brooke prepared to add Mitchell to his experimental program, Margaret appeared with a kerosene lamp and threatened to destroy the entire facility unless the journalist was released. In the struggle that followed, several of the experimental records were scattered, and Margaret was able to photograph additional evidence of the illegal procedures. Just when we think we've seen it all, the horror in Willowbrook Hospital intensifies. If this story is giving you the creeps, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Give it a like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. The exposure came when Margaret and Mitchell escaped the hospital and immediately traveled to Springfield, where they presented their evidence to state medical authorities and law enforcement officials. The photographs of the experimental records, combined with Mitchell's first-hand testimony about the basement facility, provided compelling evidence of systematic violations of medical ethics and probable homicide. The investigation that followed Margaret Sullivan and Thomas Mitchell's exposé revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had operated behind Willowbrook Hospital's respectable facade. State authorities discovered that over a period of 8 years, at least 127 patients had been subjected to experimental medical procedures without their knowledge or consent. Of these, 43 had died as a direct result of the experimental treatments, their bodies cremated in the hospital's basement furnace and their existence erased from all official records. Dr. William Brooke was arrested on February 15, 1897, and charged with multiple counts of homicide, medical malpractice, and conspiracy. During his trial, which became a sensation in newspapers across the Midwest, the full network of illegal medical research was exposed. 12 physicians in 6 states were eventually charged in connection with the conspiracy, and several prestigious medical institutions were forced to return research data that had been obtained through the illegal experiments. The trial revealed that the experimental procedures had been designed to develop new treatments for industrial injuries, surgical techniques, and medications that would later be used in legitimate medical practice. Many of the techniques developed at Willowbrook and similar facilities did eventually save lives when applied in ethical medical settings. However, the human cost of this progress was staggering. Hundreds of vulnerable patients had been sacrificed to advance medical knowledge that could have been developed through ethical research methods. Margaret Sullivan's testimony was crucial in securing convictions against Dr. Brooke and his co-conspirators. Her meticulous documentation of the missing patients and her courage in exposing the conspiracy made her a celebrated figure in nursing circles across the country. She later became an advocate for patient rights and played a key role in developing ethical guidelines for medical research that would influence American medical practice for decades to come. Thomas Mitchell's investigation of Willowbrook Hospital became one of the most influential pieces of investigative journalism of the 1890s. His series of articles for the Chicago Tribune not only exposed the illegal experiments, but also sparked a national conversation about medical ethics, patient rights, and the responsibility of medical institutions to protect vulnerable populations. The series won Mitchell recognition as one of America's foremost investigative journalists and established new standards for medical reporting. The hospital itself was closed permanently in March 1897, its assets sold to pay settlements to families of the victims. The building stood empty for several years before being demolished in 1902. Today, the site is occupied by a small park with a memorial plaque honoring the victims of the illegal medical experiments. The plaque makes no specific mention of the experimental procedures, referring only to patients who lost their lives while seeking medical care at this location. Dr. Brooke was convicted on 37 counts of homicide and sentenced to life in prison. He died in Joliet State Penitentiary in 1923, maintaining until his death that his research had contributed valuable knowledge to medical science. His personal papers, donated to the Illinois State Archives by his family, provide a chilling glimpse into the mindset of a man who convinced himself that the ends justified even the most horrific means. This mystery shows us how easily institutions we trust can hide the darkest secrets behind facades of respectability and progress. The patients of Willowbrook Hospital were betrayed by the very people who had sworn to heal them, their suffering exploited for knowledge that could have been gained through ethical means. What do you think about this story? Do you believe all the secrets of places like Willowbrook have been uncovered? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this investigation and want more stories about America's hidden medical history, subscribe, activate the bell, and share with someone who appreciates the importance of holding institutions accountable for their actions. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the untold stories that shaped our medical system. The legacy of Willowbrook Hospital serves as a reminder that progress achieved through the exploitation of vulnerable populations carries a moral cost that can never be justified. The lost patients of Willowbrook were more than subjects in an illegal experiment. They were human beings whose lives had value beyond their utility to medical research. Their story, buried for decades beneath institutional secrecy and public indifference, stands as testimony to both the horrors that can lurk behind respected facades and the courage of individuals who risk everything to expose the truth.